Alright, you guys already know I'm passionate about music. I obviously have a YouTube music channel, so why wouldn't I be? But one thing that I'm really passionate about is digging into new music and not getting stuck in the past. Now that can consist of discovering new emerging artists or stumbling upon projects that maybe I've never heard before from an older, more established artist. But lately, here in the 2020s, I'm pretty enthusiastic about how good music has actually been, especially if you know where to look. The 2020s have frankly been a fantastic decade for music so far. I'm here to talk about why I feel that way. If you're one of those older heads that is resistant to change and does not like newer things, I'm hoping that I can at least offer you an alternative perspective. So once again, I'm Ryan. I talk music. Let's go. So I'm going to do my best today to kind of explain why I think music is in such a great place in the 2020s and how that differs from the past. I want to do this without being kind of promotional or biased. What it all really just boils down to is I'm just a lifelong music nerd that's really enthusiastic about the topic. I know a large part of my following are hip-hop fans. I've done a ton of videos regarding hip-hop. I will continue to do so, but I also want to branch out to different genres. But I'm going to start this video by telling you guys just how excellent I think hip-hop has been in the 2020s. I think we're getting some of the most interesting output hip-hop wise since the 90s in a lot of cases. Now the 2010s was a very strong decade for hip-hop. There was a bit of a resurgence after the 2000s kind of had some weird identity crisis, but just the artistry and the output and the level of quality we're getting here in the 2020s is remarkable. It's easy to kind of wonder why this is, and I think there's a fairly simple answer that you could go a lot deeper into. I think the sheer amount of timeless seminal material in the 90s and even into the 2000s really did inspire a younger generation, a new generation of artists who has either already come of age or is still doing so as we speak. A lot of these newer artists obviously are a lot younger, a lot of Gen Z, but there are a ton of millennials, older and younger, that are still putting out solid output, and a lot of artists who have already been established who are hitting different strides as they get older. This is actually a really impressive thing, seeing these older artists flourish as they get older that didn't really exist in the golden age of hip-hop in the 80s and in the 90s, because simply there was nobody that was getting old at that time. Everybody was still young. You see this in a lot of rappers who are in like that early to mid stage of their career, like J.I.D. You have newer Gen Z rappers like McKinley Dixon and Mike. These artists were probably inspired by that early to mid 2000s explosion of some more high profile artists, the Dipsets, the G Units, the emergence of great underground artists like MF Doom, who became underground canon with his work in 2003 and 2004. And then for older, more established rappers, and I can't believe I'm saying his name now as an older, more established rapper, but Kendrick Lamar, for instance, you see a lot of influence dating all the way back to like 90s G-Funk, all the way up to the Game's breakout a decade and a half later. And you've seen this manifest itself in Kendrick's music since he really picked up a mic and started recording. I already mentioned the fact that I think a lot of older artists are hitting this incredible stride as they age, something we have not really seen before in hip-hop before the last 10 years or so. I'm going to start with The Alchemist, who is a producer that's been around since the mid-90s. He had some underground West Coast stuff with Dilated Peoples, Defari, artists like that, and then he really broke out on more of a national level with Mobb Deep in 1999 off of their album Murder Music. Alchemist has gone on to have just such an active, incredible career, but he's really honed his craft over the last few years, and I think he's especially done that in the last 7 or 8 years. He's got Alfredo and Alfredo 2 with Freddie Gibbs, Alfredo 2 just dropping a few weeks before this video was recorded. He's done so many different collaboration albums. He did a handful of albums with Boldy James, and by the way, I love 2021's Bo Jackson, one of my favorite albums of the decade. Go check out the song Photographic Memories, which features Earl Sweatshirt and Rock Marciano. And then Arm & Hammer. You've probably heard me mention Arm & Hammer if you've watched a lot of my past videos. Billy Woods and Elucid from here in New York. They did a collab album with The Alchemist in 2021 titled Haram, which is excellent. Earl Sweatshirt. You also know how much I love Earl if you pay attention to this channel. 2023, The Alchemist and Earl did Voir Dire. There have been many other projects that Alchemist has been a part of, and his continued progress as a producer in his 40s is one of the more impressive things I've ever seen from any hip-hop musician. And I also, of course, mentioned Freddie Gibbs, who broke out in the early 2010s. He had been around before that, but really started to gain prominence, and then breaking out with his work with Madlib in 2014. Now, Freddie was in his 30s at that time, but he's really gotten sharper as a lyricist as time has gone on. I think other than his work with Madlib, his best work has come in the 2020s. Arm & Hammer, made of Billy Woods and Elucid, who I just mentioned. They are well into their 40s. Both of those guys were apparently born in the late 70s, and they just continue continued to get better with age, specifically Billy Woods. Elucid has had some great solo stuff, but Billy Woods has given us 3 very important albums here in the 2020s. He's got 2022's Ethiopias with producer Preservation. He's got 2023's Maps with producer Kenny Seagull. And earlier in 2025, he dropped the album Gollywog. Here's a guy who's been around once again for a while, but is really hitting a stride as he gets older. Another example of this is one of my favorite rappers of all time who unfortunately passed away last year. That's Ka. Ka really only broke out in his mid-30s. He was actually a captain for the fire department of New York and sort of moonlit as a rapper, which was very interesting. And his projects throughout the 2010s kept getting better and better since he really emerged, with releases dating all the way back to 2008's Ironworks. But he's a guy who really got darker and older and wiser on albums like 2020's Descendants of Cain. He gave us the excellent The Thief Next to Jesus just about 2 months before he died, which I think was his best album. And for guys like Ka and Billy Woods, there's more of a niche for this like underground, dark, poetic, drumless style that they do. And in part, you can thank the fact that we are all just so connected. We're always online. There's going to be niches that are created by the fact that we are perpetually connected to the internet. We have everything at our fingertips. 15 or 20 years ago, guys like Ka and Billy Woods, they were grinding, but they weren't really seeing the same type of respect. And really took like the advancement of technology and everybody having these smartphones, which has been a thing since the early 2010s, to give them that platform and has connectivity and the ability just to browse while you're sitting on the toilet. As that availability has increased, so have the profile of these artists. And this is a good thing about music in the 2020s. You even look back to Billy Woods' early discography. He's got albums dating back to like 2003, which nobody knew about. These artists previously would have gone undiscovered and unappreciated decades ago. And if they did somehow end up being successful, it would be with the status of what we used to call cult success. I don't know if cult success really applies today with just how online we are. The bottom line here is you can reach a fan base easier than ever, and it really helps some of these darker artists that have more of a niche. On the other hand, you have artists that have been tried and true, have been in the game for a while, like Nas, who came out in the early 90s. The landscape of music looked entirely different. There wasn't a way to sort of be an indie rapper and release stuff on your own and make your own stuff on your own computer from your own bedroom. Nas came up, that's where he made his name obviously, but he's found a way to adapt to the new age. He kind of upgraded his sound here in the 2020s as he dropped 2 different trilogies, the King's Disease and the Magic trilogies, recruiting producer Hit Boy, who is a little bit younger than him, to give his music more of a new, fresh, almost trap-driven sound at times. So it's very satisfying to see these older, more successful minds who've been around in the game, who are vets, finding a way to adapt. Now, of course, Nas is an exception. Most artists that were around in 93, 94, 95, they have long been obscure. They are not part of the game anymore. Nas is an exception, but it is still satisfying to see these OGs do their thing. That's not really particular to the 2020s. We've seen a lot of comebacks in the past 15 or 20 years, but I feel like they're becoming more common. The thing about these older artists that we did not hear back in rap's glory years in the 80s and 90s is that in many cases they're more mature, they're more refined. They're coming from a totally different perspective than those young, hungry, ruthless, stick-up kids who are really rapping like the rent was due. And trust me, that raw aesthetic of the 80s and 90s, specifically in New York in the mid-90s, that is one of hip-hop's most admirable qualities. At the same time, it's nice to hear something different. It's nice to hear that same voice from Illmatic talk about how he's enjoying his life and living comfortably while also being able to reflect on the past and stay self-conscious. So we have this new degree of wisdom with these older artists, not just Nas. It goes way beyond guys like Nas. And we didn't really see this before just because these vets were not 48, 50, 55 years old like they are now. As people get older, they mature and you hear different things from an artist. So we're seeing different sides of these artists that we wouldn't have seen 15, 20, 30 years ago. You have artists that are quite a bit younger but are still extremely well established. I've said it before many times on this channel. I'll say it again. I think Kendrick Lamar is the most impactful artist regardless of genre of the 21st century. He's an artist that kind of came up between the Nas era and what we're seeing from some of these newer rappers today. Back in the late 2000s, he was a mixtape rapper. These guys were promoting their stuff via MySpace. Remember old websites like DatPiff? And this was kind of just before we reached those perpetual levels of connectivity that we have today. Kendrick has obviously evolved into one of the most recognizable faces in all of music, but he's found a way to transcend eras, remain relevant. You look at 2024's GNX and how modern that sounded. Some people said he was sort of dumbing it down on there, but he was actually paying tribute to a lot of local West Coast scenes, and he was putting on a lot of unknown rappers as well. And also, Kendrick Lamar was at the forefront of that resurgence resurgence of hip-hop that really took place right around 2010, 2011, when a lot of new names started to break out, and I think a lot of these new names were, as I said before, inspired by what they saw growing up in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. To a lesser degree than Nas, but still very similar to what he's done, Kendrick has remained relevant. It's a little bit easier if you're in your late 30s as opposed to your early 50s. It's really rewarding to see, after all these years, these artists that have staying power. Here we are in the 2020s. These artists didn't have a chance to demonstrate that they had staying power before, which is another thing that makes hip-hop music great in the 2020s. The 2020s have been very kind to artists like Danny Brown and JPEG Mafia, both of which have dropped amazing solo albums, and of course coming together for 2023 Scaring the Hoes, which is one of my albums of the decade so far. I love how Dreamville's J.I.D single-handedly outshined anything that J. Cole, who's the face of that label, a lot of people consider him one of the greats. J.I.D managed to outdo him just on his 2022 album, The Forever Story, anything that J. Cole has done in his career. After an excellent whirlwind decade in the 2010s, Denzel Curry from Miami, Florida, has matured and aged gracefully. Of course, he's only in his late 20s, early 30s at the time of recording, but in 2022, he released Melt My Eyes, See Your Future, which is just such an introspective, reflective effort that shows just how deep of a rapper, a writer, and a person that Denzel Curry is. I really enjoyed watching one of my top 5, Dead or Alive, Black Thought, get together with producer Danger Mouse in 2022 for the album Cheat Codes. I just mentioned Freddie Gibbs and The Alchemist with their Alfredo series, and Alfredo 2 being released a few weeks before this was recorded, and also released a couple weeks before that was the return of Clipse with Let God Sort 'Em Out. I covered these two albums and a number of other albums that dropped in the summer of 2025 in my previous video. Go check that out. I'll link that up in the corner. I could go so much deeper into hip-hop and talk about the niches that have been carved by these experimental artists like JPEG Mafia, like Clipping, the Bandcamp, SoundCloud, and mixtape circuits that helped break artists like Mac Hami, who's really risen to prominence here in the 2020s. The emergence and newfound respect of international scenes such as the UK. You have the emergence of really quality spitters like Little Sims, for instance. This is really not new anymore. This has emerged kind of in the past 10 years, but you do have this sort of DIY aspect to hip-hop. Music production technology is accessible to really anybody who knows how to work it. That has helped now massive names like Tyler, the Creator, become what he's become today. This was also the foundation for underground legends like Little Ugly Mane. But as I said, if you know how to work a computer, you can make music, and this has actually led to an easier way for hip-hop artists to rise up as well. So it kind of goes both ways. This is for better or for worse type of thing. But this ease of production and this ease of available and easily operable technology has certainly helped many of these true artists thrive and break out and find their niches in some cases, which is something, again, they may not have been able to do decades ago. So technology plays a real key in why hip-hop in the 2020s is so spectacular. Enough about hip-hop. This concept goes way beyond hip-hop itself. This really did manifest itself, this whole DIY thing, during the pandemic. Now that was obviously a terrible, scary time, but it did really help shape what music has become in this decade, and it really, I think it has contributed to a lot of positive things, actually. First of all, during the pandemic itself, we saw just this incredible crop of albums come out kind of in the second half of 2020, when everybody was locked away in isolation and they had nothing else to do. So hey, you know what, let's drop another album. I think back to albums that were very self-produced and done in isolation, like Charli XCX's How I'm Feeling Now from 2020. And then Phil Elverum actually resurrected the Microphones project, coming back with the album Microphones in 2020. Most of these albums were created in isolation, and there was kind of a need for these artists to do something, and they gave us some great output. But they mostly did it by themselves. There weren't a lot of big budget studios being used at that time. You also have Big Thief singer Adrienne Lenker and her 2020 album Songs, which is a masterpiece. She did that in a cabin in Massachusetts during isolation. Who knows, if the pandemic didn't hit, would we have had albums of this caliber? That's what makes me think. I think the pandemic actually changed how musicians kind of thought about how to make an album, how to record and market these albums, how technology and recording software has just made it easier than ever for these projects to get done. They're getting done without big budgets, they're getting done without huge record labels, without that pressure of studio time. And on top of that, it's kind of without major promotion, as because of the emergence of social media, because just about everyone and their mother is on social networks artists now, it's easier to promote without the help of a big budget, big evil label than it ever was before. This, of course, was becoming a thing in the 2010s. This is not particular to the 2020s, but I think the pandemic really accelerated this. Overall, I think these things have taken a lot of pressure off of artists, so the creative process for these albums is not rushed. A lot of artists get signed to deals for 5 or 6 albums, and their last 2 albums, they just mail it in just to fulfill their contract. I think we're going to see less of that now that these artists are kind of becoming more self-sufficient. Of course, there's still big label stuff going on, but some of the most critically acclaimed albums are done sort of independently. These artists, they don't have this financial implication, this contractual stipulation either. I just think overall it allows these musicians to be more true to their own artistry and style. This is the case, I'm going to go back to hip-hop for a second, for JPEG Mafia's seminal 2021 album LP. This was created all by himself, self-released, self-produced. It seems like JPEG had creative control over the entire album. And even before the pandemic, like I said, this is not a particular thing to the 2020s. You had artists like Fiona Apple, who did her album Fetch the Bolt Cutters. She did that in the late 2010s using GarageBand. You can hear like her dogs barking during some of the songs. It's actually pretty cool. It gives kind of a unique, intimate feel. So more reclusive and private artists. Some of the best artists are these people who are awkward and don't feel like dealing with big businesses. They now have this option to operate on their own schedule, and create more of their art in a pressure-free environment. And I've noticed this is leading to a higher overall quality of music. So I guess the 2020s kind of brought along this new necessity for these artists to sort of act on their own. There was also a lot of collaboration going on while in isolation. It was more seamless than ever because we're, again, all connected. And I think that really changed the collective mindset of artists, of real, true artists. We're not talking about Drake or Tekashi 6ix9ine in this case. We're talking about real, true, calculated people who are just passionate about the music that they make, and it is their whole life. One thing that I think that we don't quite see enough of in the modern day is the emergence and the thriving of local music scenes. For hip-hop, once again, I'm going back to it. It's my wheelhouse. Get over it if you don't like it. There were a lot of regional scenes back in the day. East Coast, West Coast, Southern hip-hop. Now, due to this technology and the fact that anybody, you could be hanging out in North Dakota and make hip-hop album of the year if you really try hard enough. You could blame technology for that, but at the same time, it is great to see different sorts of talent coming from different corners of the map. But these local scenes, they still do exist, and there's one scene in particular that comes out of London, England. It's the windmill scene. I think it's one of the most exciting and vibrant scenes in modern music. It's named after a venue in London, and acts like Black Country New Road, Black Midi, and Squid, among other bands, have come up through this windmill scene. These artists kind of got their start playing at the windmill and have gone on, in the cases of the bands I mentioned, to achieve international fame and success. I mean, Black Country New Road, they came out at the end of the 2010s, but really started releasing albums in 2021. Their debut album from that year, For the First Time, is just an amazing record, one of my favorites of the 2020s as well. And then 2022, they came back and released Ants From Up There. I mentioned Black Midi, fronted by the amazing Geordie Greep. They had 2 albums again in 2021, 2022. After breaking out at the end of the 2010s, Black Country New Road is a little bit more like post-punk, a little bit less abrasive, but Black Midi utilizes aggressive, brutal prog styles, which it's unlike anything I've ever heard. They had 2021's Cavalcade and also 2022's Hellfire before the band unfortunately broke up. That's actually one of the more sad things to happen in the 2020s that I wish hadn't happened. Having said that, we would not have gotten Geordie Greep's seminal debut album from 2024, The New Sound, one of my favorites of the decade. I got to see him here in New York. He put on an amazing show. If you haven't heard The New Sound, go check it out. I believe I named it number 2 on my top albums of 2024 at the end of last year. You can check that video out in the corner. Electronic music here in the 2020s has been excellent as well. You have Jessie Ware's excellent 1-2 punch of 2020's What's Your Pleasure and 2023's That Feels Good. We have Charli XCX's summer of 2024 defining album Brat, one of the best modern pop albums, one of the most danceable records I've ever heard. You have more synth pop, psychedelia-driven projects like those of Magdalena Bay. They came out in 2021 with their excellent debut, Mercurial World, which was followed up with an even better and even more enjoyable second album, 2024's Imaginal Disc. Indie rock has been alive and healthy with great projects coming out from Vampire Weekend, including 2024's Only God Was Above Us. They have a pretty deep catalog. I think this is their best album. On the more aggressive side of things, we have Jeff Rosenstock's 2023 album Hell Mode. Indie folk also continues to pop off. You had Sufjan Stevens coming back in 2023 with the album Javelin. I've always loved Sufjan. He's got a great, deep, very artistically sound discography, and Javelin was one of his best albums. I talked about these artists getting better as they're getting older. That seems to be happening outside of hip-hop. Same Same deal with Phil Elverum as part of the Mount Erie Project, one of 2024's best albums in the record Night Palace. I talked about Adrienne Lenker earlier. Her band Big Thief had a very long but absolutely beautiful album, Dragon New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You, and she gives us one of the all-time vocal performances on that album. Seriously, one of the most impressive singing jobs I've ever heard from any decade, any genre, ever. I'm a metal fan, okay, and I often criticize metal for being kind of as soft and uninspiring as it's been since its existence here in modern times. I think relative to other genres, metal's output has been very weak, but you still have great bands like Oklahoma City's Chat Pile emerging here in the 2020s. They have their own extremely unique brand of this nihilistic, groovy sludge metal. New Zealand death metal band Ulcerate, who's been around since the late 2000s, another artist that seems to be getting better with age. They've had their two best projects, in my opinion, in the 2020s. 2024's Cutting the Throat of God, their latest album at the time of recording, is one of my top 5 metal albums of the decade. You have Black Gaze band Deaf Heaven returning to their roots from 2013's Sunbather and having this amazing triumphant return to form on 2025's Lonely People with Power. Colorado's Blood Incantation even had a fantastic album in 2024. That's the album Absolute Elsewhere. It's my favorite in their discography. And you have these artists from yesteryear sort of re-emerging here in the 2020s with great work. I mentioned Clipse as Let God Sort 'Em Out. The big one for me is The Cure coming back in 2024 with Songs of a Lost World after a 16-year hiatus. And it wasn't just some average album, oh yeah, it's nice to have The Cure back. No, this is one of their best records. Even The Strokes coming back and getting back in their bag with 2020's The New Abnormal. So right now you have this great mixture of all these new artists emerging, with the Chat Piles and the Magdalena Bays being my favorite artists to break out here in the 2020s, to artists from the 2010s kind of honing their craft and getting better with age, like Kendrick Lamar, Ulcerate, Tyler the Creator, Charli XCX, to seeing comebacks from these artists who have been dormant for years and even decades in some cases, the biggest example of course being The Cure. I don't think we've ever really been at a point in music before where we saw all these things happening at once. And as a music fan, as somebody who's up for discovering new music every day, every week, this is extremely satisfying to me. It's also not entirely new to the 2020s. We saw a lot of it in the last decade. There were comeback albums and great stuff coming out in the 2000s as well, but it just seems to be getting better and we have more of an offering from week to week. And I'll be blunt, the 2020s, they are my favorite music decade so far since the 1990s. I'm just so intrigued and interested in many of these projects we get every single week. New Music Friday is becoming one of my favorite things. I just love watching so many new artists emerge while seeing these other artists branch out. And I feel like these new artists have a much easier time if they really want to break out and if they're talented, not having to go through the politics of a big record label. As so much stuff nowadays has that DIY component and it's so easy to promote your own stuff if you're an artist like never before. There's the emergence of new subgenres that are keeping things interesting and engaging. Listen, the world has turned into a scary f***ing place within the last 5 years or so, specifically here in the United States. Things have been pretty dystopian, if I may say so myself, but the music to come out during this decade has been extremely impressive and has been a nice distraction, frankly. You can thank the internet and social media for shining light on so many great artists and projects, with the caveat, of course, being that social media is one of the biggest contributors to large parts of our modern day dystopia, but whatever, that's a story for another day. You gotta take the good with the bad. Would I sacrifice this excellent amount of musical output for a calmer, more simple, more happy and peaceful world? Yes, I absolutely would. But since I can't do that, what I'm gonna do, and what I suggest you do, is be happy with this great musical output that we're privileged to enjoy. So I'm gonna go ahead and exercise my right and privilege to enjoy all this great new music that we've had in recent years and that's still to come. Thank you very much.